Now today I want to go over array implementation, and we are going to be implementing few methods. So 8 methods in total, starting from push all the way to length. Now arrays are a special kind of object. Arrays extend object by providing special methods to work with ordered collection of data. In essence, again, it's an object. Now we know that in array, every element has an index, and access is cheap, meaning that it doesn't really take a lot of work to get value at a certain index, because if we know the index of an element, we can get it instantly. We don't have to loop through the whole thing. We can get it by just giving it a index, and we are able to access the value at a O of 1 time. But insert and deletion is expensive. And why is that? It's because we have to re-index all the elements. So for example, let's say that we have our array 1, 2, 3, and 4. If we were to delete, for example, the number 1, we would have an array of 2, 3, and 4, right? But when we do that, we have to re-index all the elements. So this one had an index of 0, 1, 2, and 3. But when we re-index it, we have to shift everything over to the left. So this one has 0, 1, and 2. So shifting over all the elements, it's expensive, and that's why it's O of n. Insertion works pretty much the same. Let's say that we have that same array, and this is index 0, 1, and 2, and 3. Let's say that we want to put number 0 at beginning of the array. So that's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this time we re-indexed everything to the right. And that operation again is also O of n. So that's why insertion and deletion is expensive. Now I do have all the time complexities over here for all the methods that we are going to implement. And again, these are the methods that we want to be able to implement. I don't think this is going to be too hard, but I think it's a really good starting point for data structures. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks. Let's go over our first step to implementing an array and their methods. So before implementing any of the methods, we have to first create an array class, and these are the pseudocodes for it. So first thing is obviously create an array class, and we are going to pass in a constructor function that's going to instantiate our object. And next, we want to create a property named store, and then set this equal to an empty object. And that's where we are going to be storing our elements. And you can call it whatever you like, to be honest. You can call it data, anything that works. And next, we are going to have another property named length, and that's going to check how long the length of our array is. So given that, let's try coding our solution. First thing, I want to create a class named array. We are going to pass in a constructor function. This is going to have two properties. First one is the store, which is going to be set to an empty object. And next is length, and we are going to set that equal to 0. Now let's instantiate a instance of our array class or array object. So that's going to be const array, and set this equal to a new array, pass in nothing, and let's just console log our array. As you can see, we have our array. So our store is where we are going to be storing our elements, and length is going to be tracking or keeping track of how many elements we have in our array. And obviously, as we implement more methods, we're going to be storing elements to this array object and increase our length. And if you were to remove any elements, we would obviously remove it from this store and then decrement our length. Now let's implement our first method, which is going to be the push method. And I have my description here. And what does push do? It simply just adds an element to the end of the array. Now it's going to take one parameter, which is going to be the value that we want to add. And these are the steps, really straightforward. So now let's start implementing our push method. So push is going to take a value, and how do we add a value to the end of the array? So this is going to be this dot store, and we want to be able to access the last index because we're pushing it to the end of the array. So that's going to be represented by our length. So this dot length, and we set that equal to the value that we passed in. Next, after we push in an element, we want to increment our length by 1. So it's going to be this dot length plus plus. And you can actually simplify this. What you can do is you can just delete this line and let's just use post increment, and that's essentially doing the same thing. So one line, really simple. We are storing our value to our store at this index, which is represented by the length. So when we have no elements in our array, this is obviously going to evaluate to 0. So at index 0, we are storing our value. And after we store it, we are increasing our length by 1. So let's see if this worked. So here we have our new instantiated array that we made. And let's try using push on this array that we created. Let's push in 1 and let's copy this and push 3 elements. Now, if you were to console log our array, we would expect those 3 elements to be in our store and length should be 3. And if you look, we have our elements. So at index 0, we have value of 1. Index 1, we have value of 2. At index 2, we have the value of 3. And our length is correct, which is 3 because we have 3 elements. So that's it for push method. Now let's implement our second method, which is going to be pop. And pop just simply removes the value at the end of the array and then it returns that value. Now pseudocode is if the array is already empty, that means that there's nothing to remove at the end. So we are just going to return. Next, we want to store the value that we are going to remove to a variable so we can just return that variable later. And then we want to delete the last element and then decrement the length by 1 and return the element that we removed. So let's code our pop method. The first thing is to check, well, is array empty? If it is, I just want to return because there is nothing to do. And if our length is 0, this evaluates to false, and opposite evaluates to true. So if it's the case that our length is 0, we're just going to simply return out of this. And next, I want to store my value to a variable. And this is going to be this dot store. And how do we get the last element? Well, it's going to be this dot length minus 1. And later, we are going to return our pop value. And now we want to be able to delete our last element. So how do we delete our last element? Well, to do that, we're going to use the delete, and it's going to be this dot store at this dot length minus 1. This is how we delete an element, and we decrement our length by 1. This dot length minus minus. So this is it for our pop solution. So what we do is we check, well, is the array empty? If it is, we are just going to return out of this. We are storing our last value to a variable because if we were to delete it, obviously that's not going to work, right? We are going to be able to return something that's already deleted. So first we store it to a variable, we delete it, we decrement the length, and then return it here. Now to test our code, let's use pop just once. So array pop. And let's just actually console log this to see if it returns the correct value. And we should expect to return 3, which it did. And let's just console log our array one more time just to see if it really worked. So we do have our store where 3 is removed. So we have 2 numbers, 1 and 2, and length is correctly decremented by 1. Now let's implement our unshift method. And I think unshift method is actually the one of the hardest method to implement. So what unshift does is it simply inserts a value at the beginning of the array. So it inserts an element at index 0. And this is obviously going to take a parameter, which is the value that we want to insert. So using a loop, we want to reindex all the elements starting at the end of the array and shift all elements to the right because we will be pushing in a element at beginning of the array. And we want to push everything to the right. And then we want to insert the correct value at index 0 and increment the length by 1. So now let's implement our unshift method. Our unshift method is going to take a value. So for using a for loop, I want to iterate through my array, and this is going to start at index equal to this dot length, and I want to iterate until I is less than 1, and I want to decrement by 1 each time. Now I need to be able to shift all the elements, so that's going to be this dot store at index I, and we are going to set this equal to this dot store at index I minus 1. Well, if this line confuses you, well, remember that if you were to add a new value, that means that our length of the array is going to increment by 1, right? But before increasing the length, we know that the last element is going to be represented by this dot length minus 1, which is same thing as I minus 1. So we are getting the last element to this variable and storing it or shifting it to the right, which is represented by index, which is this dot length. So let's say that we have 3 elements in our array. So our length is going to be 3, but our last index is going to be 2. So we're setting element at index 3 to element that's at the end of the array, and we are keep doing that until we reach I is greater than -1, or until we do it for all the elements in our array. And after that, what we want to do is we want to set first element to the value that was passed in, since we are adding a new element at the beginning of the array. And then we want to increment our length by 1. So this is it for shift, and let's check if it worked. Now we have uncommented our pop method. I want to get rid of this one, and let's see if our unshift worked. So array dot unshift, and let's add in the number 0. And as you can see, we have our 0 at the beginning of the array, so that has an index of 0, and you can see that everything was correctly pushed to the right. So now number 1 is at index 1, 2 at index 2, 3 at 3, and length is 4, which is correct. And if you were to look at our array before, it was 1 at index 0, 2 at index 1, and 3 at index 2, and length of 3. So what we did was we got this element, which is 3, gave it a new index, which is 3, and shifted to the right. We got our number 2, shifted to the right, which is now at index 2. We got our number 1, shifted to the right, and that's at index 1 now. And our 0 is going to be still 1, but we override it with the value that was passed in. So it replaced the 0 now, and we have our final result. Now, if I were to just console log my store here, you can see how it changes. You can see that for the first iteration, we created a new index, which is 3, and we set this number 3 that was at index 2 to 3, and now we moved our 2, which was at index 1, to our second index, and we shifted our 1 to right, and here now our element at index is undefined, but we set the first item to the value that was passed in. And if we were to console log our store here, you can see that everything's looking good. So in the for loop, simply we are just shifting all the elements to the right, or re-indexing all our elements. And then after we're done, we're setting our first element to the value that was passed in, and we increment our length by 1. Now let's implement the shift method, where we remove the first item in the array and then return that element. Now we want to check if the array is empty. If it's empty, we are just going to return out of the operation. And then next, we want to store the first element to a variable. We want to shift all elements to the left. We want to delete the last element and decrement the length by 1. And finally, return the removed element, or the element that was shifted. So this is kind of opposite of what we did for unshift. So let's start coding. So let's create our shift method. And first thing we do is if our length is 0, that means that it's empty, right? So we are just going to return out of our method, or shift method. And next, you want to store our element, and let's call it shift, and this is going to be this dot store at index 0, and later we are going to return that element. That looks good. Now we need to traverse through our array, so let's create a for loop. We're going to start at index I, and we want to iterate onto the length, and we increment by 1 each time. Okay, that looks good. And now we want to shift all our elements to the left. So it's going to be this dot store. Index I is going to be the next element, I plus 1. Here we are setting our current element to the next element. And the reason is because since we are removing our first element, we can just override it with the next element. And we do that for all our elements. After that, all we have to do is we want to delete the last element, because otherwise, if we were not to delete it, we would still have that element in our array. And after that, we want to decrement our length by 1. Okay, that looks good. And let's check if this method works correctly or not. So let's get rid of unshift. And now we have console log array shift. And that returned us a value of 1, because value of 1 was the first element in our array. And you can see that everything is re-indexed really well. So we got rid of our 1, 2 became the first element, 3 became the second element, and our length is looking good. Now let's look at how this worked again. Let's console log store. And here you can see that we shifted our second element, which was the number 2, to our index 0, and 3 is moved to index 1. And now our element at index 2 is undefined. But here we are deleting the last element. So let's console log here one more time. And you can see that we have our correct array of elements. Now let's go over our get method. And this is going to be really simple. We are simply just returning the element at a given index. And this is what array is good for, right? Arrays are good at accessing elements. It's all one operation. So let's implement our method. So get is going to take a parameter index. And we simply check, well, is the index out of scope? Meaning, is it an invalid index? If it is, we are just going to return out of this method. So if index is less than 0, or if index is greater than the length minus 1, we want to just return out of this method. And here we just simply return this store at element index. Now let's check if this worked. So let's have console log array.get. Let's try -1. So that should give us undefined, which is good. And let's try index 3. That should also give us undefined. So looking good. Let's try index of 0. Should give us 1. Index of 1 should give us 2. 2 should give us 3. So that's it for our get method. Now we are going to implement a insert method, where this is going to insert a value at a given index. It's going to take two parameters, value and an index. And before we implement it, we want to have few checks. So if again index is out of scope, we want to just return, just stop the method. If it's empty, we just want to use the unshift method, where we insert the element at the first index, or you could actually just use the push method. It doesn't matter. And if index is the last index, that means that we don't really have to traverse through all the elements, right? We can just simply add it to the end of the array. So use the push method that we implemented earlier. Next, we want to shift all the elements to the right until the given index, because if you were to put it in the middle of the array, that means we have to move all the elements up to that index to the right, and we insert it and increment the length by 1. Now let's implement our insert method. So insert is going to take a value and an index. Now if index is less than 0, or if index is greater than this dot length, I just want to return. Next, I want to check if it's empty. If it's empty, that means that our length is going to be 0. If it is, I just want to use my unshift method. It should be this dot unshift and pass in my value here. Or you could have actually just used push here. It doesn't really matter. And if our index is equal to the last index, what we can do is we can return this dot push and pass in our value. Okay, that looks good. Next, we want to be able to iterate or shift all elements to the right up to that index. So it's going to be for let I is equal to, we're going to start at the last index, so this dot length, and this is going to be until I is greater than our index, and we increment by 1 each time. So same as before, this dot store I is going to be equal to this dot store I minus 1. That looks good. and we want to insert our element. So this dot store at the given index is going to be equal to the value. And since we are adding an element, we want to increment the length by 1. This is it for our insert function. These are just our if cases to make this a little bit more simple and a little bit more fast. So if it's out of scope, so meaning if the index is invalid, we want to stop. If our array is empty, we just want to use the unshift method. And you could have just used push method here, it doesn't matter. And if it is a case that our index or our given index is the last element, that means that we can just use our push method. And finally, if all these are false, we will use our for loop to shift all the elements to the right until we reach the index, and we overwrite our index over here with the value that we want, and finally increment the length by 1. If you noticed, this whole operation is pretty much same as our shift method, right? It's just that when we use shift, we did it for all the elements. So we iterated until I is greater than or equal to 0 or greater than -1. But we do it up to our given index for this one. And otherwise, it's exactly the same. Now let's check if this really worked. Let's do array.insert and let's insert 0 at index 0. And we made a mistake in our code because this should be decremented, not incremented. Okay, let's go back to our checks. Now let's uncomment this. And you can see that we inserted our 0 to the 0th index. So it looks good. Our length was increased. Let's give a invalid index. Let's try index -1. So this is undefined. So that's why it didn't do anything. What if we were to insert at index 4? It didn't work. 3 should work because we are putting it at the end of the list. If you were to put it at index, let's say 2, you can see that it worked. It's at the correct index. So 1, 2, 0, and 3. So it looks good. So we know that our insert function worked really well. Now let's go over our delete method where it's going to remove a element at a given index and return that element. It's going to have a parameter of index, and this is going to be the given index. And we check, well, is the index out of scope? That means that it's a invalid index we want to return. If our array is empty, we want to return. That means that there is nothing to delete. If our index is 0, it's same thing as our shift method. So let's just use our shift method. And if all our index or if statements fail, let's first store the element to be removed to a variable, because if we do our operations first, we are going to lose our element. So we store it and return it later. After we store it, we want to shift our elements to the left, starting at the given index, because we don't really have to touch anything before that. And after we're done, we want to delete the last element because remember, after we shift all the elements, there's going to be one element that's clinging over. So we want to delete that. And finally, decrement our length by 1. So let's implement our delete method, which takes in a parameter of index. And we need our checks. Well, if it's out of scope, I want to just return out of this whole method. I just want to stop. So index is greater than this dot length -1. I just want to return. Okay, that looks good. And if it's the case that array is empty, I want to stop. And then next, if it is a case that index is equal to 0, I just want to use the unshift method that I implemented. So return this dot unshift, and we want to pass in the index. All right, that looks good. So if all my if statements fail, I want to store my deleted element to a variable, and this is going to be element at given index. Next, I need to shift all my elements. So starting at index I is equal to index, our passed in index, and we iterate until I is less than the length, and we increment by 1 each time. And here we override our current element, which starts at the index, to the next element. So technically shift everything to the left. After we are done shifting, we want to decrement our length by 1. And later we want to return our deleted element. And we forgot one thing. We want to get rid of the last element that we weren't able to delete. So this dot store at this dot length -1. So we're deleting the last element here. So let's check if our code worked correctly. Let's run array.delete and let's try 0. Let's console log and that returned 0. Okay, so it did not delete our element. So let's go back up, and that's because we used unshift. We should have used shift to delete an element. So let's go back down to see if it worked. And you can see that we deleted our first element, which is index 0, which is element 1, and we returned the correct one. Let's pass in a index of -1 to see if it worked. So undefined. And if you were to delete element at index 1, that's the number 2. We return 2. You can see that our elements are re-indexed and our length is looking good. Now, again, we should have used shift here instead of unshift. Unshift is adding a number. We want to remove a number. So shift here. I hope you caught that mistake. Now it's going to be our last method, which is going to be the most simple method to implement. And here we just simply return the length of our array. So we just return this dot length and that's it. I don't think we even need to try this out. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks.